So we've got our Aspire application working on the desktop for development. What we're going to look at this week is how we can deploy it, and specifically deploy it to Azure. So let's just take a quick recap of what it was we had. So remember, we had essentially the two projects, the API, which was just providing data, and then the front end, which was a hosted Blazor WebAssembly application. And then we added last time the Blazor pre-rendering.app host, which is the Aspire app, which pulls it all together basically with that configuration in program. And so if we just run that up on the desktop, we can see there we get the Aspire dashboard, and we can do things like click on that Blazor, and that will take us to the actual Blazor application. Or indeed, we could click on the API, and that will take us to the Swagger that we had configured on the API. And lastly, we also, because we had this idea of a reverse proxy and forwarding, we could also actually go to the Swagger on the front end, and that would just be forwarding it to the back end, so we see exactly the same thing there. So that's what we're going to now deploy to Azure. But before we do that, we've got to do a few little things. One of them, and really only one of them, is something that is very specifically about Aspire. And that we've got to do here in the program page. What we've got to do is onto the Blazor pre-rendering project. That, remember, is the front end project. We're going to put on an extra thing that didn't matter when we're doing this in development, but does when we're doing it for deployment. We do a dot with external HTTP endpoints. And that basically means that it's exposed to the web so that people will be able to access it. You might think, well, surely you want that anyway, but actually we don't, because the API only wants to be exposed to our front end, not generally. Or let's say it does. That's the idea we've got here. So we can expose one of them, but not the other. We'll see a bit more about that when it's deployed. That's something that probably you would put in right at the beginning when you're developing Aspire. I left it out because it wasn't necessary for the bare bones we're looking at to get started, but it won't have any effect on us in development, and it will certainly help us a lot when we're deployed. Other things we have to do, which are more general to just doing deployment, what I'm going to do is, firstly, in the API program, I've got to do a couple more things with Swagger. One thing I've got to do is, as well as do this add Swagger gen, that will work again when we're running locally, but you can see the AI is prompting us. We also have to do this add endpoints API Explorer. That will get that working. And then the other thing we've got in terms of Swagger is, at the moment, we're only going to be displaying the Swagger front end if we're in development. And when we deploy to Azure, obviously we're not going to be in development. And although it's up to you, certainly in some situations it is useful, even when you're deployed, to allow people to use that Swagger front end. And certainly it'll show us what's happening here. So I'm going to get rid of the conditionals there. And so that will allow us to see that even when we're deployed. Another thing relating to that is our settings. So if we look at the settings on both of the main projects, we can see we've got the app settings.development. Nothing much in the API on that, but in the front end, that's where we've got things like the address of the API using this new specific Aspire format. And also we've got the reverse proxy configuration, again using that format. And that's all in development at the moment, so it's not going to apply when we deploy. So I'm going to take all of that and cut it out, because we don't really need it to be in development anymore, because one of the nice things about the way that Aspire works is, because we're no longer hard coding localhost and a port in there, it doesn't need to be different. That configuration doesn't need to be different from development and production, so we can just put it there in the main app settings and that will work fine. So those are really the main changes we needed to make. We've moved things out of development into production, or into both actually in both of those cases. And the important one, we did that with external HTTP endpoints that we saw on the Aspire program. None of those should have any effect on our development at all. So really, we would have put them in there from the beginning in a real application. I was just building it up step by step, and we should see we're getting exactly the same behavior. So that's all working fine, no issues there. So now let's do our deployment. So what we do is we're deploying the Aspire project. So we right click on that one and go to publish. And it's just giving us the one option, the Azure Container Apps for .NET Aspire. So we'll just click next on that and then choose the various bits I want. So that's my subscription. The location, let's just put it somewhere locally. So I'll put it in UK South. And then the environment name, basically this is going to be the name of the resource group that we see on Azure. So it's going to create quite a lot of individual resources, and it makes up the names for most of those. But let's call this Blazor Pre-Rendering Aspire. Okay, so Blazor Pre-Rendering is the name of the project. We've just got Aspire in there. Click Finish on that. And it'll take a little while to do this, so we will speed up time and jump to the end. But there you can see it's created the published profile, which we now see we've got here. So not actually published it yet, but it's got all of that working. And we can see the various bits of information. It's now just doing a bit of refreshing on that. So again, let's give it time to do that. A lot of these steps take a little while, so I can't do them in real time. And now that one's ready. And so finally, having done that, let's click the publish button and let it do its work. And once again, that's going to take quite a while. So we will cut to the chase on that one and wait till it's deployed. And there we are. Really took quite a long time, over 5 minutes for that, but you can see it's done it, publish succeeded. And if we just scroll down, we can see a few other things. We can see all of the things that's created. So it's created the resource group. And remember, I gave that the name, and it's just added RG- for resource group on the front of that. But then it's got these various things, these two container apps, this container apps environment, container registry, managed identity, some logging, all in the resource group. And so although it's got up here, this Open in Azure portal, I find that doesn't take us to a particularly useful place. First place I'd like to go to is the resource group. So if we go in there and just make our login, then we can see we've got our resource group, and there are the 6 things that it created in there. And let's take a look at some of those. So I think the important one to look at is the fact that we're now dealing with containers. So when we were running the Aspire app on the desktop, the 2 projects, the pre-rendering and the pre-rendering API, were both just running as normal .NET projects. But when we deploy them, they are packaged as Docker containers, and we can see that because we've got the container registry that's been created. And if we go in there and look at services and look at repositories, there we can see it's just showing us the 2 Docker images for those 2 projects that we had. And we can see that it's created those for us. So we don't have to worry about that. So they're in the registry, and we could add further ones if we wanted to in there. We can see the 2 actual applications. So these are the 2 things that are running. But really the most important thing to look at is the container apps environment. So if we look in there, that is really the whole thing that we've got all in one. And we can see in there, we've got the 2 of those. But what we've also got, and we'll see this in a number of places in Azure, there we've got the open dashboard. So if I click on that, and again, this is secure, it's part of my Azure application, so I've got to do the login there. But we can see now there we've got the dashboard looking very, very similar to what we had when I was running this locally. We can see it's given it a fairly crazy sort of URL. So we've got a Aspire dashboard, and then it's made up the rest of that. But that's really fine because that's just for our internal use. But we can see we've got the 2 items in there. So we've got the actual front end and the API. And slightly different though, it's not showing quite the same endpoint. So remember, if we look at the code, something I did last time, we put in 1 additional endpoint and also renamed the existing one to Blazor. Well, all of that stuff is just ignored when we deploy to Azure at the moment. Maybe later versions will get that in there, but that's what we've got at the moment. So we just get, again, these rather made up names, but you could obviously associate those with your own domain if you wanted to. But if we click on the Blazor pre-rendering, it does exactly the same sort of thing. And there you can see we've got our application, we've got everything working. So it's all working all the way through, and all that stuff about it looking up the URL for the backend that we saw locally is happening when we deployed, so we didn't have to do any additional configuration, and that's one of the really nice features there. We've also got our various consoles, so we can look at what's happening. We've got the front end. If we take a look at the back end, then we can see there we've got the logging that we set up previously for calling the books and calling the authors. All that sort of thing is working there fine. So pretty good as to what we can have. But the thing we can't do is if we go to the API and I click on the link for that, then we're getting this strange thing, the container app is stopped or does not exist. So that's the thing about this idea of the container apps environment. It contains both the Blazor pre-rendering and the Blazor pre-rendering API. But because, again, back in the code, we only did the with external HTTP endpoints for the front end, the back end remains hidden, and is visible to anything else within this container apps environment, which is the front end, but is not exposed on the web. And so that gives you extra security, better control over what's going on, and that sort of thing. So that's a typical sort of thing we do. We don't have to do it like that. I'll change it in a moment just to show you the difference, but that's what we can do. Remember, of course, we've also still got our Swagger available on the front end. We haven't got the link I mentioned, but it's still there. So if I do a /Swagger on there, then it will again forward it to the API. So even though the API isn't accessible, because we've done the forwarding, it is accessible there, and so we can still see it if we wanted to. Remember, I said it's not always the case you're going to want to expose it, but I'm just showing you what can be done. So that's really what we have there, and we can add to that, and we'll see that in later videos, how we can add more features. But you can see pretty simple once we've got that going, and we can run it in Azure. Let's just make one slight change to that. So let's close this down and just take that with external endpoints, and let's pop that onto the API project as well. Not that it's necessarily something I'd do for real, but it'll just show what's happening now. Because now, if we, having done that, go back to our publish and just publish it again, just while we're looking at that, I'll mention something that was added when we did the initial publish is this azure.yaml. So it's just put in a YAML file with the basic instructions for how to deploy this. Not something that we need to change very much, but it's there, and sometimes you will make alterations to that. But mostly it'll be done automatically by Aspire itself. And so there we can see we've got that working. And so let's go to the container apps environment, which I said is the most useful one. And then let's go to the dashboard. And the front end is still going to be working fine. Nothing different about that. But the back end is now also available. If I click on that, well, we're getting a different error there. It's not saying it's not completely available. It's just there is no specific endpoint for that, because when we're looking at that, we need to put Swagger on the end there. And so we can see that there we're getting the backend available directly if you wanted that. One last thing to point out though, although I've been doing this through the Aspire dashboard, obviously these endpoints are available publicly as well. So if we go to that one and let's just copy all of that, and then let's bring up actually a completely different browser. So let's go for Edge. So don't have any login credentials or anything set up on here. And let's just paste in that URL. We can see that this is actually available and working on the web. So you don't have to do it through the dashboard. The dashboard is a developer's tool. I had to log in to do that. Whereas here, this is how the actual end user would see that. And it's still all working fine. So that's it. Basic deployment using Azure. In future videos, we'll see how we can add other features, other containers to our application to make it more powerful, and see how really carrying on with deployment is very, very simple once you made those few changes that I showed you there. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, do click like, do subscribe, and I'll see you next time.